We'll now continue with the discussion between the Rebbe and R Mordechai Eliyahu, which is printed in Sefer Asichas Tavshinun Beis. We are now holding, this is part 5 on page 455, Seif Yud Gimel. Rav Eliyahu said to the Rebbe, in regards to the questions of doubt that will arise in the times of Mashiach, we find in the Gemara Sheyishalu Eitzel Moshe v'Aaron that as far as these questions are concerned, they will ask Moshe and Aaron, who will be resurrected at the time when Mashiach will come, these questions, and they will answer the questions. Uladugma. So, for example, Meisim le'osid lovei tzrichim hazor shlishi ushvi oy ein tzrichin. It's known that in order to be purified from tumah, from impurity, when a person has come into contact with a dead person, they need to be sprinkled with the water of the red heifer of the paraduma on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. So there's an interesting question. At the time of resurrection, when people will arise, do they also need sprinkling on the 3rd day and the 7th day after their resurrection in order to be able to enter into the temple precinct? Alexandria as Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania. This is one of the questions which the men of Alexandria asked Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania. So he said to them, This is a Gemara in Nida Daf Ayin Omid Beis. Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania answered that when Mashiach will come, Moshe Rabbeinu will be resurrected with them, and he will answer this question. So from this Gemara, it seems that there will be no need to ask the question by the Sanhedrin, Kivin sheyelchu miyad leMoshe Rabbeinu, because they will go and immediately ask the question to Moshe Rabbeinu. The Rebbe smiled and he said, Ani mishtadel lahagdel es kavod harabonim. I'm trying to raise the honor of the Rabbonim, sheyitzarchu lishal etzlam, that we should ask questions by the Rabbonim. Rav Eliyahu said, Aval Yosef kedai leleches yasha leMoshe v'Aaron meyasha leleches leSanhedrin. But surely it's better to go directly to Moshe and Aaron than to go to the Sanhedrin. So the Rebbe responded, Eitzel Moshe Rabbeinu yishalu b'negeh ledvarim shalamdu mipi hashmua. By Moshe Rabbeinu they will ask those things which Moshe Rabbeinu learned when he was on Har Sinai, and he heard directly from Hashem, Divrei Kabbalah, which are words of Kabbalah. Shekiblu al pi ha-Masorah ish mipi ish ad Moshe Rabbeinu, things that were heard and given over from one generation to the next, right until Halacha LaMoshe miSinai, what was heard by Moshe on Har Sinai. Im kibul miSinai kach ukach. Moshe Rabbeinu will be asked, did you receive on Sinai this or this? However, matters which are learned by principles of exegesis and deciding halacha according to be'achas min amidah shahatorah nidreshes behen, one of the rules of how the Torah is expounded, kiven shetolui b'das harov shel beis din hagodol, since Torah itself says that is dependent on the majority view of the great Beis Din, acharei rabim lahatois, as it says clearly in the Torah, that one should follow the majority opinion, lo yoyel habir reitza Moshe Rabbeinu. Then it won't help to ask what the opinion of Moshe Rabbeinu is, or Moshe v'Aaron, or even if Aaron is with him. Shehem rak shnayim, because together there are only two. But what will be needed will be the majority of a Sanhedrin of 71. And here, it's not going to help the fact that Moshe was the greatest of all prophets. Shahari ein navi rashai lechadish davar, because a prophet is not allowed to introduce a novel ruling or novel mitzvah in the Torah, kiven shaTorah about lo b'shamayim hi, because Torah is not in the heavens, but it was given specifically to the Beis Din here on earth to decide on. We find prophets in the chain, golden chain of tradition of the Torah. As it says, Moshe kibel Torah misina masara liyeshua v'yeshua lizekenim uskenim lenevim. That Moshe received the Torah from Sinai and he gave it over to the elders, who gave it over to the prophets. It's not that the prophets were there because they were prophets. Rather, yes, they were prophets, but that which they received as halacha, as Jewish law, directly as received from Moshe Rabbeinu. And they gave over that tradition to the men of the Great Assembly. ומצם זה יש מוקם לשינויים בדברי התורה שנקבע בהם ההלכה, על פי דעת הרוב בבית דין הגדול, על פי דעת הרוב של בית דין הגדול שבימי המשיח. That explains to us how there may be differences in the halacha according to the majority opinion of the Sanhedrin, as it was in bygone times, and how it will be when the Sanhedrin will be reconstituted when Mashiach will come. As the Torah says explicitly that one must go to the judge who will be in those days. One must only go after the Beis Din which is in your generation. And if the opinion of the majority of the great Sanhedrin that will be reconstituted in the days of Mashiach will be shona, different, midas harei bebezin agadol shebedeira shelifnei than the majority opinion of previous Sanhedrins, tikba ha'alacha kedas harei bebezin agadol shebiyemei Mashiach. The halacha will be fixed according to the majority opinion of the Sanhedrin, as it will be in the days of Mashiach. And with this we can explain that which the Arizal writes, that although nowadays when there is an argument between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, we rule according to Beis Hillel, however, in time to come, the halacha will be according to Beis Shammai. And the reason is because when the Sanhedrin will be reconstituted when Mashiach will come, they will again discuss the matter and follow the majority opinion, which will rule according to Beis Shammai. So the halacha therefore will change from being previously according to Beis Hillel nowadays, and then it will be changed according to Beis Shammai, but with a majority ruling of the Sanhedrin. Rav Eliyahu responded, Beis Shammai mechaded etzvei. Beis Shammai was sharper than Beis Hillel. And that's why it was necessary for a heavenly voice to come down and say that the halacha should be fixed according to Beis Hillel, because they were the majority. In other words, even though the minority was sharper, nevertheless, the halacha follows the majority. And also because they were easier to pacify Beis Hillel, and that's why the halacha was according to them. The Rebbe responded, however, that which we rule that the halacha is according to Beis Hillel is not because of a heavenly voice or a prophecy that said so. Rather, it's because there was a majority opinion that ruled according to Beis Hillel with their own intellectual capabilities. But through discussion, it came out that the halacha was the majority opinion, according to Beis Hillel, al pi haklolim shekiblu Moshe Rabbeinu, according to the principles that Moshe Rabbeinu laid down, Yud Gimel Midrash Shatena Nidreshes Behem, the 13 principles of exegesis, klolim she'enam tzluyim b'das harev, and those rules are not dependent on the majority, liyosem mapi hakabbalah, because they were received by tradition. And upon those rules are based all the discussions which finally come to a ruling according to the majority. Rav Eliyahu then said the following: Yesh chakira b'negei l'chiyuv karbonos l'osid lavei al devarim shenasu bizman hazeh. There is an investigation in halacha about the obligation to bring offerings in time to come for things that were done nowadays. Mechad gisa, from one point of view, nasis hakapara bizman hazeh al yidei limud seder hakarbonos. The atonement has already been achieved for the misdeed nowadays through learning the order of korbanos. Kedivri haGemara meMaseches Megillah, as the Gemara says in Masechta Megillah Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, Amar Avram lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Avram said before Hashem, Ribono shel Olam, Shema chas v'shalom Yisrael chaytim lefanecha. What will happen if the Yidden sin? Amar lo kachal yagel u'mishaleshes. Hashem said to Avram, take the korban. Bizman she'ein beis hamikdash kai mateh aleim. So Avram asked, but what will be at a time that they won't have a beis hamikdash? Amar lo, Hashem said, kvar tikanti lehem seder korbanos. I've already instituted for them the reading of the korbanos, kol zman shekorin bahen, and when they read the parsha of the korbanos, malo ani aleim kilu makriven lefanai korban. I considers it as if they had actually brought a korban. As it says that somebody who engages in the law of the chatas is as if he's brought a chatas. And I will forgive them for all their sins. So from there it seems that there is the atonement even nowadays by reading the parsha of the korban. However, from the other point of view, we find that Rabbi Yishmael made a note in his ledger that for this and this that I have done, I will have to bring a fat chatos when Mashiach will come and the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt. So the implication is that engaging in the study of the Parsha of Korbanos is only as if one had brought a korban. But it doesn't free a person from bringing a korban when the Beis HaMikdash will be built. The Rebbe responded, the obligation to bring the korban is then when the Beis HaMikdash will be built. But in that moment before the korban is brought, the teshuvah is complete through reading the Torah and the parsha of the korban, in a way in which our lips, when we read the Torah of the korban, it's as if we have brought the korban. Neshalma gam miloshen shlemus. Neshalma means as a payment. In other words, our lips will pay instead of the korban, but it's also an expression of shlemus, of completion. Kach shegam ha-teshuvah hi b'shlemus, because the teshuvah is complete. Hainu, which means sheyesh le'es kol ha'mayla shel-bal teshuvah gomor, that a person even nowadays has all the advantages of being a complete bal teshuvah, inclusive of the advantage that through doing teshuvah, the geula will come. To the extent that Mashiach will come so that the tzaddikim will do teshuvah. Shegam eitzel tzaddikim tia mailas teshuvah. That also by tzaddikim there will be the advantage of teshuvah. V'chidush miyuchad v'inyan zeh b'nigei l'giur. And there is a novelty here in this halacha in the matter of conversion. Giur bizman shebeis hamikdash hayakayim nasa alidei mila utzvila v'karban. During the times of the Beis Hamikdash, a conversion was completed through three things: circumcision, bringing immersion in a mikveh, and bringing a korban, bringing an offering. The ilu bizman hazeh, however, nowadays, she'ein sham korban, where we don't have the Beis Hamikdash, we don't have an offering, tzarich milu utzvila, one only needs the first two things, circumcision and immersion. And when Mashiach will come and the Beis Hamikdash will be built, so then the Geir will then need to bring the korban. Nevertheless, nowadays when a person converts, he's 100% Jewish, he's 100% a convert, even without bringing the korban. Rav Eliyahu said, Din ze lemeidim im masha kosev, v'chiyogur itzchem ger l'doireseichem afagav deleka mikdosh. This, the Gemara in Krisis learns from a special pasuk, that it says, if there will be with you a ger in all your generations, in other words, that gerus, that conversion is applicable, even though there will be a time there will be no Beis Hamikdash, because the Torah says, for all generations there can be gerus, there can be conversion. So we see that even though it's not possible to bring a korban, nevertheless, the giur is full through the mila and tvila, through the circumcision and the immersion. The Rebbe responded, but this is the novelty in this. That not only now, where there's no Beis Hamikdash, is he considered a complete convert, but the chidush is that even when the Beis Hamikdash will be built, he's still 100% a ger for all matters, to the extent that immediately he would be able to eat the kodshim, the food of the Beis Hamikdash, and his daughter would be allowed to marry a kohen sheyashamish b'kuhuna, who will perform the service of the kohanim k'sheyabana Beis Hamikdash b'tchilas yemei Mashiach, when the Beis Hamikdash will be built and the kohanim will do their avodah. Sheboina Hamikdash, because Mashiach will then build the Beis Hamikdash and the kohanim will do the avodah. Oid lifnei shehevi korban, and even before he has brought a korban, in other words, even before the geir has brought his final korban, nevertheless he'll be able to eat kodshim. Ki hagir shehis geir bizman hazeh hu giur gomor, because the conversion which was achieved nowadays is complete. V'hakorban hu chiv b'fnei atzmai, and the offering is a separate obligation. Rav Eliyahu responded, even in terms of measurements of Torah, there will be possible change in time to come. We find in the Gemara in Yuma Daf Pei Amud Aleph, that somebody who eats less than an olive's amount of a particular prohibited matter nowadays should write down exactly the amount that they ate. Perhaps the Beis Hamikdash will be built in their days, and the Sanhedrin will be reconvened, and they will discuss this halacha again, and they will say that the person does need to bring a korban for this very small amount that was eaten. The Rebbe responded, Shiurim hu inyan b'fnei atzmai. The measurements of Torah are something separate. Ki gam k'she'ena chayav korban, because even when a person does not have to bring a offering mipnei she'achol pachas mikashir, because they ate less than the amount which would be obligated to bring a korban, harei ze davar iser. The eating of less than that amount is also prohibited. Kivin shahashir hu rak ligabe oynish. The measurement of obligation is only in terms of punishment. In other words, what one had to bring a korban. Aval ha'isa, but the prohibition hu betokvei is still in its full strength. Gam b'pachas mikashir, even if one eats less than that amount. Shahari chatzi shir osam in Torah, because half the amount is also prohibited according to the Torah. Rav Eliyahu responded, Nistapakti ba'odam shehika es chaveirei hakar she'em b'shava pruta shaloika. I had a question about one man who would strike another and the damage would be less than a pruta, which is a small coin, in which case he would receive malchus. Whereas, if a person does damage by a strike, a pruta's amount, then he has to pay, but he does not get malchus. So if, in the case that the first strike was less than a pruta's amount, is he allowed to hit him again in a way that the second strike would add to the amount of damage, making a pruta's worth of damage, and then the person striking would just pay the damage and he wouldn't have to have malchus. Or does each strike individually cause an obligation to receive malchus? The Rebbe responded, Hashir de shava pruta hu b'negei l'chiyav tashlumin. This amount of a pruta is only in terms of payment. Aval gam b'pachas mikashir, but even less than the amount she'ein chiyav tashlumin, where there's no obligation to pay, yeshna isa, there is a prohibition. Ka'omar, as we've said, shegam chatzi shir osam in Torah, that also less than a shir is also according to the Torah. Rav Eliyahu responded, Yesh chilukei deis im isa shel chatzi shir hu b'chol davar oi ba'achila bilvad. There is a discussion as to whether the prohibition of half the amount is only in reference to eating something or in other matters as well. The Rebbe responded, Medivri Rabbeinu Azakin, from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch mashme, it implies sheha'isa dechatzi shir hu lo rak b'midid achila, that the prohibition of half the amount is not only in things we eat, shemefurish bikra, which is clear in the verse, elegam b'shar isurim, but also in other prohibitions. V'zil basatayma, and it makes sense. Shahashir eini ela b'nigel lekamas o'isa, because the measurement is only a quantitative issue. Aval muhuso isa, but the actual prohibition, the essence of the prohibition, hu b'tokvei, is in its full strength, gam b'pachas mikashir, even in less the amount. Rav Eliyahu said, Kach mashme gam divrei Rashi b'Mesechah Shabbos. Yes, that's the implication of Rashi in Mesechah Shabbos, Daf Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, v'chi mutar lefes pachas mikashir, where Rashi says, is it prohibited to bake less than a shir? The chiyuv chatas leka isu misuriika. Rashi says, although there is no obligation to bring a sin offering, but nevertheless there's still a prohibition. The kaimelon chatzi shir osam in Torah, because half the shir is osam according to the Torah. So we see not only in eating is there a prohibition, but also in baking and in other prohibitions. The Rebbe said, Yesh devar pele b'maharam chalva. The Maharam Chalva says something amazing. He says, less that which we say that chatzi shir is awesome in Torah, that half a shir is prohibited, but less than half is not prohibited. However, that's an individual opinion, and the majority opinion is shechatzi shir lav davka, that when we say half, it doesn't mean exactly a half. Elegam pachas mechatzi shir, but even less than a half is prohibited. Afilu kol shehu, even a tiny amount. Asam in Torah. Rav Eliyahu responded, Bal Yoshev Holim, there was a sefer called Yoshev Holim. He argues, Marich bebir divrei hamedrash, and he goes at length and explains the words of the Medrash al pasuk on the pasuk. He nasna li min ha'etz va'oichel. She, meaning Chava in Gan Eden, gave me Adam Rishon from the tree to eat. Ve'ochalti ein kesivkan. It doesn't say and I ate. Ela va'oichel and ate. Ochalti va'oichel. De lechoira tamua per kodesh yoma davar zeh. Seemingly, how is it possible that such a holy mouth could say such a thing? She'achalti pachas mikashir. The answer is that I ate less than the amount. Va'oichel pachas mikashir behefsik b'chdei achilas pras. That I ate less than the amount, and then I waited a certain time, and then also ate less the amount. And that's why a double expression of achila is used in the question, because it's hinting and telling us that the instruction was even not to eat less than the amount. Any amount is no good. The Rebbe responded, more than that we find in the poskim, that a mashahu, which means a tiny amount, does not have any measurement, and it can be divided and subdivided into thousands of measurements, thousands of mashahus, of tiny amounts. Rav Eliyahu said, this is a special reference in terms of chametz on Pesach, whose prohibition is on the tiniest of amounts. Rav Eliyahu said, the Radvaz writes, that the reason why the Torah is stringent when it comes to chametz more than all the other prohibitions is because mipnei shechametz bePesach remez liyetzer hara, because chametz on Pesach alludes to the evil inclination. And according to this, we can explain that which is written, that a person cannot bring any sa'ir, any sourdough, kol darka. The Torah says any amount, afilu kol shehu, even the tiniest of amounts. Because the entire year, not just on Pesach, one can't bring chametz. The Rebbe said, milvad b'chag HaShavuos, apart from on Shavuos, shaboy makriv shtei alechem min hachametz, when one did bring 2 loaves from chametz, av she'enam krevim ala mizbeach, even though they're not brought on the mizbeach, ba'aleim nemer korban reishis takrivu oisam l'Hashem ve'ala mizbeach lo yalu. So the Rebbe now explains why one may bring and should bring the loaves of chametz on Shavuos. V'nyane ba'avedas adam, the idea is an avodah, she'isr chametz hu mishum gaiva, because the prohibition of chametz is because of arrogance. Avol binyani kedusha shiny, but in matters of holiness it's quite different. V'adarabba, on the contrary, lo yizu b'lvad shegaiva muteres binyani kedusha, not only is pride permitted when it comes to holy matters, but more shahagaiva binyani kedusha hu inyan tov v'chiyuvi, that pride in matters of kedusha is good and positive. Kameshakasav, as it says, vayigba libo b'darkei Hashem, that his heart rode high in the ways of Hashem. Ve'inyan zeh mudgash b'miyuchad b'chag HaShavuos, and this matter is emphasized on Shavuos, shabei makrivim shtei alechem min hachametz, on which we bring the 2 loaves of bread, chametz, zman matan Torah, the time of the giving of the Torah. Sheyehudi goy b'chal ha'teikef, because then a Yid is so proud, with tremendous pride, shezacha lekabalas haTorah, that he merited to receive the Torah. V'zacha levarer v'lifsik dinim b'Torah, and he merited to rule in Torah. V'lo yoid, ela shebetur ha'ira shah nitzin lehakoyach liyas ba'alabayas ala Torah l'loi kol hagbolos. Not only that if there comes what's called a ha'ira shah, which means a moment, he's allowed to override rulings of Torah In other words, he becomes the owner of Torah without any limitations, as we previously mentioned. V'yehi rotzen, said the Rebbe. V'hu ha'ikar, and this is the main thing, shebekarav mamish, that very soon yisbatel legamri ha'inyan abilti rotzu shebechametz sharemes liyetzahara, that the negative side of chametz, which is the yetzahara, should be annulled. Kameshakasav, as it says, v'es ruach hatumah min ha'oretz, by Hashem removing the spirit of impurity from the world, that not only a tiny amount will not be left, but the ruach, even the spirit of it, will be removed. Rav Eliyahu said, ruach hakadusha, and then will be revealed the spirit of holiness, ruach hapeinu Mashiach Hashem. The Rebbe said, about this it's already said at the beginning of creation, that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. As the Medrash points out, that refers to the Spirit of Mashiach. And only after that it says, and Hashem said, let there be light. The implication is, even before there was light in the world, there was the spirit of Mashiach. Rav Eliyahu said, Mayim reimes al Torah. Mayim hints to Torah. Ein mayim el Torah. V'kiven sherucha shel Mashiach hi al pnei hamayim, and since the ruach of Mashiach is on the face of the water, harei ze l'mayla me ha-Torah. It means it's higher than the Torah. K'vi she'amar kavoday, as the Rebbe has said previously, She Yisrael, Shemashiach hu goyal on She Yisrael, that Yidden and Mashiach is the Redeemer of Yidden, Heim l'mayla me'al Torah, are higher than Torah. The Rebbe said, V'yesh l'hoise b'dik haloshen al pnei hamoyim. One may add that it says on the face of the water, Miloshen pnimius pnei, coming from the word pnimius, inner. She Yisrael heim l'mayla gam meha pnimius de hamayim, that Yidden are higher even than the pnimius of the water.